right. Hello, hello. Today we are going to be taking designs that we worked on last week in our live composition session together to look at how we can now take this to being an actual design, because it's one thing if you have some ideas written out on tracing paper, but how do you move them onto your actual page? And so a lot of people were asking me, well, how do you transfer from this to this? And often it's that I rewrite it, because typically you're going to do your sketches as a small scale piece, not something that is big enough to fit the entire paper. So I'm just going to put that one to the side because this is the one that I thought that we'd work with. One thing that you can do is go through and create a guide so that you know where it's going to be placed on your page. Before we get into that, I just want to show you what we're going to be working on today, and that is working on adding depth with coloring so that you can see elements that come in the front and elements that go behind. All right, I also get asked a lot about the paper that I'm using, and this is a mixed media workbook by Strathmore. Now, the thing about this is that it's not the smoothest paper that you're ever going to find, but I also do view my brush markers as consumable items, so often I do replace them when the tips get worn out. The reason that I use mixed media for this is because you're adding a few layers of color, so you do need a thicker paper to be able to withstand that. So some of the thinner papers, if you're adding lots of color, yes, they're smooth, but you're going to end up with fraying and sometimes even with holes in there. Not fraying on your pen, but fraying of the paper. Okay, let's get into today's design, which is just because now if you have a ruler with you, anytime you have a design like this, you want to measure it out. How tall is it? And how wide is it? Because that little bit of information will be so incredibly helpful for you then laying it out on your page. Now, because I forgot to grab a ruler, look at me go, I'm going to use a makeshift ruler. So it is approximately 1 Stabilo pen long and 2/3 of a Stabilo pen high. Now, let's use the pen. This is about the center mark, and up and down as well. Let's go, I think it's right about here. Now, the reason that I'm using the pen, even though it doesn't show me where the center is because if I look at a design, my eye is having a hard time finding the middle between here and here, because then you're focusing on the words, and sometimes your words are higher, but the design continues down further. And if you want to find the midpoint, having an item like this even, where you're just looking at a blue section, blue to blue, where's halfway in the blue? That will be a much easier way to find your midpoint. So the midpoint's right about here. Now, when you're transferring it to your page, I also like to draw the sides and the top and bottom. That sort of gives you the bounding boxes for what you should have in the 4 quadrants of your page. I don't actually want to turn this. Let's keep it up and down. So now, knowing that I have these bounding boxes and up and down, you can start to sketch out those same bounding boxes on your page. So straight, up and down, and see, already I've gone and made this more of a square than a rectangle, and this is definitely a rectangle. So make sure that you are consistent with your shapes and that you're getting your rectangles versus your squares so that your transfer of your design will be easy. So I've just sketched out the exact same background shape there, and of course using a ruler is probably a way smarter way to do this. But now you have a basic idea. The J goes in this quadrant, most of the U goes there, the downstroke of the U here, and it hits the center. So go through, and with a design like this, you want to sketch it out with a pencil, keeping in mind this is way too tall, keeping in mind sort of the placement. So the U is much smaller than what I had done. Goes from there down to about the bottom, and then the S is about half the height of this area. So it's right about here. And as you're doing this, it doesn't need to be the exact same. I would say pay attention to main things like design elements. Okay, this cross stroke needs to actually cross both of them. That's an important design element to maintain. But otherwise, I've already noticed that my T is probably too tall. That's just stuff that you want to play with as you move over to the other portion of your design. And if things change, that's okay. We're basically getting the idea of what we had here before and getting it onto the page. And you also want to make sure you're not drawing in too heavily with your pencil. Just get a general sketch in there, and then when you add color, you want to erase all of that. So that's why you want to do it nice and light so that you are able to still go through and erase. So this B is going to hit right about the side, but it actually starts pretty high up here. Now I'm noticing I don't have a ton of space. I probably did those other ones a bit large. So that means, again, the design has to change. Let's overlap the design a little bit right here. It's making the B a bit ugly. And you still do want to be evaluating your design. So now the J is quite a bit bigger, so maybe I say, well, this J then, let's curl it up here and make it fit that way so that the B can sit right here. And go through and do these changes to your design, because sketches sometimes will look different when you go in to do the actual design. Maybe you notice you don't have enough space to add your beautiful upstrokes and downstrokes. You have to make things a little bit wider, and you want to make sure that you're still flexible with what you're creating. All right, so we have a U and this S. This is also an important design element because it fills in a lot of this space on the bottom and mimics the flourish up on the top. Whoa, that S really got away from me. That was a little extra flourishy. So while it might not be the exact same as what I have here, we still have that basic idea, and we're filling in the page that way. All right, so I notice it's a bit far to this side. That's fine. This is not something that I'm thinking, oh, it has to be perfectly centered, I'm going to put it up on the wall. This is just work that I'm doing. And I find that sometimes when you're doing pieces, if you're thinking, oh, this needs to be absolutely immaculate, it needs to be perfectly centered, then it's just going to stop you from creating. So don't worry about it being absolutely perfect or think, oh, now I need to go back in and redo it. Forget that. Let's just create. Let's just enjoy making something. So once you do that, you want to go through and erase it. If you put your marker onto your pencil and you have not erased it enough, especially if it's a light color, you are going to be setting that pencil mark into the paper. So you want to go through, do a light erase so that you can still see where things are. Of course, if you're using a darker color, you don't have to worry about it so much, but if you're going to use a yellow, make sure that you go through and erase quite well so that you don't have to worry about your design showing through. Now it seems counterintuitive, of course, to go through and draw everything and erase it, but that's what we're doing. Okay, now before I actually get on and start a design, I always do some test. There. Those are too nice of pages. I usually like to do some color tests, so I'm just looking for if I have a previous color test page, so I don't need to use up a new piece of paper. I usually have one per book, but I might have ripped it out already. Okay, this page it is. Now, you don't need to have fancy pens to do color blending. Actually, you probably don't want to have fancy pens. You want to have one brush pen, or two if you're going to use two separate colors. So pick a brush pen. Let's see. Maybe we'll test out an aqua and a blue. I usually like to pick a few to test with, and then pick a final color from there. So the reason that you want to pick a few, oh look, it nicely matches, is because you're trying to find a complementary color, something that can darken your color up but still blend with your color. So you want to be able to have a shadow on your color that looks like it's just a darker version. Now, some pens, especially if they're in a set, they're related. So you can see that this is a darker version of this. Now, you can also and might want to use a bullet tip pen because that will allow you to have nice control over where you're putting your color. You can also, too, use Crayola markers because in a Crayola marker box set, you have so many different colors that it's very likely you're going to find a color that complements what you have down on the page to make it darker. See, oh, this is like the exact same color as that. To make it darker so it looks like it has a shadow, but it still blends together. And you also want your shadow color to be dark enough that it stands apart. It's sort of, you're on a bit of a high wire? It's not walking wire. On a bit of a wire with this because you need to find that perfect balance. So as I find two markers that I think look nice together, I usually like to write down their color code, but Crayola Super Tips, it's just, hey, here's your pen. And there's no color code. So if you find two that you think complement each other well, put those two together to the side. So those two look nice. And I didn't plan out that one. I just happened to grab a good marker. Now, trying to match up this guy right here, we need like a dark blue. Oh, maybe this navy would be the right color. I even like to do a few tests beside because sometimes the color is different than what it ends up being. See this? I don't think that'll look very good. I don't think it will blend because it's not really the same type of blue. This one though, definitely not this one. This one has a totally different color to it, whereas this one could work. I almost need something in between. In between or in betwixt. All right. I like to do a line like this so that I can see what the blend would actually look like. Oh, this one doesn't even change the color, so it's definitely not that. And then there are some times where you just think, well, maybe I'm just not using that color because you can't find a nice blend. But I think that those two actually are okay together. So those are getting put to the side. And then you have to decide, well, am I just going to go ahead and use one of those colors? But because we want to find a few different options, I'm going to do a few more. So let's put these guys to the side and we'll continue with the Crayolas. So trying to find a complementary color for this, it needs to be darker, but the same sort of tone. That's a totally different type of blue. This one has like a dark periwinkle, whereas this is more of an aqua. So that could work. I think it might not even be dark enough. And you want to do these tests because you are going to spend quite a bit of time. Yeah, see, that's not even dark enough. It's not going to make it really look like a shadow. You're going to spend a lot of time doing your design, so there's no point in just going through and keeping, you know, not doing all your tests and then going through and creating something that doesn't actually look like it has impact. And you also want to consider that you're probably going to go through, oh, those are nice together. You're probably going to go through and do some color editing or lightening to your piece. So the contrast needs to be high enough that the two don't end up blending together. In person, this one looks nice, but on screen or in a picture, you're probably not even going to see much of a difference. So I'm going to do a few more of these strokes. Now this color is a bit trickier because in this box, there isn't really something with this interesting, like, bright pink purple base. So we'll try, oh, that's nice. Try a purple, which doesn't have enough contrast. Let's try maybe this darker purple, which has more contrast. And sometimes, see, putting it to the side, maybe you can't really even see what the color is, but once it's on top, the two colors do end up going together, so they end up working. All right, so once you have your different color sets, you can decide the overall look that you're going for your piece. Do you want to use more than one of the sets of color? Do you want, like we have two words, do you want to just stick with one and be consistent with it? And if you do two, which ones are going to complement each other? Like this one is quite light, So I think that one isn't going to work quite so well if we were to pair it with one of these others because they're very rich and saturated. So I'll just put those two away. That being said though, in the future the combination might be nice. So you might want to even put a tag onto the blue, write it down here. You know, having a code chart of colors that look really nice together saves you from having to do these tests all the time. So I'm trying to decide if I want to do this one and this one, or this one and this one. I think I'll do these two. So again, these ones, you could always put a little tag on here saying that it complements this one nicely. For now, I'm just going to put them to the side and then get going with the other marker sets. So we have our brush pen with a complementary darker color that is a bullet tip pen. Well, sort of. Chisel, no, it's not even chisel. Angled tip pen, because they want you to be able to do everything with it. And then the same for this set. And there's a good amount of contrast between the two. So going back to the sketch, because these are darker colors, the sketch is okay the way it is. Just look through for any other areas where you might have to erase a little bit more. So you're not setting that pencil in there. And then you want to go through first with your brush pen. Let's start on the J. We'll do one letter at a time as you move through. And actually, let's write all the letters first, and then I'm going to go in and add in the deeper color afterwards. Sometimes I like to do that because it allows the marker to dry. If the colors are still wet, oh, I haven't warmed up this morning. This is a bad idea to be doing this live without warming up. And I just smudged that. Oh, Monday. Oh well, let's just continue with it. I really should have warmed up, but if the ink is still wet, then sometimes it doesn't blend, or it blends too much and you don't get the deepening of color, you just get an addition of color. One other thing though, when you're using your markers, you want to see what additive strokes will look like. So what I mean by that is, if you do one stroke, so maybe just, why is that the same color? One stroke and then you do another one on top, what does it look like? Because maybe they're side by side and you end up with this thicker portion here. How many times do you have to go over it until it's one solid color? Or does it just keep adding and getting darker and darker? You can see this one's getting darker and darker in the middle. So you want to know how your markers work so that you know how you can add them together. Some of them, if you do side by side, it'll actually blend if the ink is still wet. So you can see, like with this Stabilo brush marker, the Pen 68 brush, in the middle you can't see that line. It blended together. So that's just one other little test that you want to do so you know how your pens work. And don't smudge your work like I just did there. That was not great. I'm just going to thicken up this downstroke a little bit. Now because I've let the marker dry, there's a bit of a line in the middle, but again, this is just to create. Okay, so now what you want to look for, first are layers where you might have an overlap, where one stroke goes over top of the other. So one of those, it's going to be like it's sitting on top. Even just take this paper clip, for example. Let's just make it even uglier. This piece of the paper clip's going on top, this one's going in behind. The top one stays the brightest and the lower one has a shadow, slight shadow cast on it on either side. And that's exactly what we're going to do here. So there's no right or, oh, all my stuff ran away from me. There's no right or wrong answer for which one goes on top, but typically it would be the one that's put there second. So you can be flexible with this, but the one that was there first, which would be the skinny one, you want to add color right on the very edge of that top one. And then you want to go in and just with teeny tiny little strokes sort of blend it out a little bit, where you have your marker not giving like a straight line, but just a feathering effect out of that area. And you also might want to turn your book so that you're always pulling to yourself, which gives you a little bit more control over your pen. Okay, so we've only done this one here, but then you get to big thick ones like this. So does your cross stroke go on top, or does this body of the J go on top? Again, totally up to you, but whichever one you choose, draw a line on either side and then do your feathering on the stroke. Now another thing that you can do is, especially if it's still wet, and if you know how your pen works, you can always go into with your pen and try to drag that color out a little bit. But I know that once it's dry with the Stabilo, you end up with an additive effect. So because I've made this extra wide, I probably don't want to go in and drag that down. And you know what, having that contrast there is going to be okay, because that contrast will just give even more depth. Now, any other overlaps? Well, sort of right here. So we'll just do a little bit coming off the top. Like this is casting a shadow down. And then there are other areas where you can go and add more, because this has absolutely no depth put in here. So then you can look for areas where your stroke comes in here, but then this S comes on top, and look for those areas to add that same depth to. So draw your line first right up against the line that's coming on top, and then feathering away from it. That's your cast shadow. That could also happen here in the middle of your U. So your first stroke came up here, and then another one came down on top. So drawing in that line, and then dragging it down to do a bit of a cast shadow. So that way you're able to get depth even in letters where there's not an obvious overlap. Another area that you can do it is where it might turn. So if you imagine that you have a piece of paper and it comes down and then it needs to turn back up, it's almost like it's tucking in behind. So that's where you would add another cast shadow from your top one. So this one would be in the shade a little bit. So we have our top one coming down, and then right around here it needs to fold, and it would have a cast shadow going back up. Now you might even just decide to color this whole portion dark, showing that that whole thing's in behind. And again, that's absolutely personal preference, either a feathering or this whole bit being dark so it looks like it's behind. And again, even at the ends of your, or even at these sorts of turns here, you would have your T stroke coming down and then up to the tail. So it would fold right around here and then up. But because this one doesn't also have a cast shadow on the top, you would just want to feather. You don't want to go in and keep, let's just feather that quickly. You don't want to go in and keep that going all the way up, because no, this part's getting the light as well. This area here would be a return. You know what, I'll just do that whole thing dark as if it's in behind. And even here we have our J stroke, and that can have a little bit of feathering going up in there as this folds up and turns. Okay. Oh, well, you know what? Even here. Which way do we want our S? This will be on top, so this goes in behind. And then a bit of feathering, feather that guy out. So let's also do that on this end bit. Now, I colored in the whole end there because it's just tiny. If it's just a tiny little guy like that, your cast shadow would go all the way, because, well, by the time that you get to the end of where you'd feather, it's pretty much all gone. So those places of overlap, those places where there's overlap within a letter, and then places where it might turn and fold in on itself are all areas where you can add some depth. Let's go into purple now for the because word. When you're creating, don't feel like absolutely everything you create needs to be picture perfect. Sometimes it's just about figuring out new techniques or figuring out colors that worked well together or don't work well together. That's just as important to know. So don't think that everything needs to be perfect. Sometimes you just want to do some creating. That's also part of why I'm not freaking out at these little smudges. It's just not worth it. Honestly, it's just not worth it. Now, as you're writing, you can also pay attention to places where you're getting overlap already, because like a pen has crossed another line, and pay attention to which one came first, you know, chicken or the egg. So here, this one was our last stroke. Do that darker purple on either side. Oh, this one hasn't really dried yet. Sort of, you can see it soaking in a little bit. And then once you've done that, feather out from there on both sides and work your way through your entire word like that. So you can even go back, like, okay, this was on top, so that means this portion's on top, that means this portion here is underneath. And go in reverse like that to figure out which one goes on top and which one goes underneath. You just want to make sure that you're consistent, otherwise the eye's going to be like, there's something off here, and you don't want the viewer's eye to be saying that to their brain, because then it looks wrong. All right, so even here, this one was on top, so this one goes underneath and with a little bit of feather, underneath here with a bit of feather for that cast shadow. And, oh, here we've got another overlap. This one, see, now this one would have gone underneath and this one came up on top, but I feel like that's going to look a little bit weird, so that's when you can use your artistic license to put the other stroke on top instead, if you would like. That one I'll just drag all the way out. Okay, so once you've done that, now look through for your areas where the letter stroke itself would overlap part of the rest of it. So here we have a letter stroke that's going to come on top. So that part of the E would be hidden, and let's feather it down. Here we have the A coming over top of the C, feather it down. And even here, the A, this stroke comes on top of these other strokes. So bringing those ones around, bring that there. The U is going to come on top of this A, and these ones I'm just drawing all the way to the bottom because we have not much space, and I know that the feathering is going to end up hitting into this other stroke that's going to be looking like it's in front. So that's why I'm not really wasting time with doing too much feathering on these shorter strokes. All right. Oh, this E right here, that would be filled in, and then feather that guy out. And even the B, so this stroke of the B could cast a shadow on this lower portion, just a little bit there, just something to give a tiny bit more dimension. And then once you do that, you want to look for areas where it's changed direction. So this part of the paper or ribbon was in front, and then this part here goes in behind. Whoops, went off my line there. That's okay. Now for the C as well, that part in front, that part behind, and feather that out a little bit just because it's a bit shorter. That's in front, that's all behind. Just make sure it meets up properly. And even for the S here, this part would go in front, so then this part here might be behind. And you might decide that if you have too many changes in color here, it's going to throw it off. So just make that whole part the dark purple. And again, that's totally up to you how you'd like to do that, how long you want your cast shadow to go. And having it go a little bit further increases the contrast between your two colors, which can help to increase that look of depth. But you also don't want it to take away from the look of the piece you're going for. So this part gets feathered out because this isn't overlapped with anything. And then the C as well, if this is on top, then this part would be underneath for a little bit. Just take a little extra off there with the finger. Fingers can be a good tool for lifting color if you get to it fast enough. All right, and then this part of the E down here, Feather it up. Oh, out of the line there. That's okay. That's when you just make the feather a little extra wide. And even here, so this stroke comes up, you could have a bit of darkness happening right in that curve again. We're just trying to give some depth to all of those curves. Okay, so looking at the bee, we have a long light line here, some depth happening here because of the cast shadow of this part of the bee, and then we'll get a little bit of depth right here where the ribbon sort of changes direction. And then again right here, this is out in front, this is in behind, and underneath with a little bit of feathering. So going through and doing something like this to your letters can give them even more depth. You can go back and, especially in these shorter sections or the skinnier sections, go in and add a little bit more darkness if you want to, once it's dry, by doing a whole other layer. And again, in your piece, that can help to give extra depth. And you don't need to blend it out as well because it's already a little bit blended from your first go at it, but adding a little bit more depth will just help give it even more pop on your page. Okay. So now, oh, I forgot this part. Now as the purple dries, you can go through with the purple and give it another layer. And this is when you're really doing it just close into where the ribbon would have changed direction, or there would be the cast shadow, not all the way, but just a little bit more to deepen that initial shadow right close to whatever's casting the shadow on it. So right close to the S is where you want to go in and deepen it up with just a little bit more, right close to where the E returns here, right close to the bottom where the ribbon flips. That's where you want to add a little bit more. If you feel like your color isn't dark enough, and when you add more, it's not actually adding the way that you want, you can always try to find a darker color of purple or a darker color of blue, or of course, whatever color it is you're using, and draw that guy in. Because the more depth that you have with the layers of color, so even the darker purple, the lighter purple, and then your brightness, that's just going to make your piece pop even more. So, oh, this guy's so scary dark. Just going to add more right into these nooks and crannies. A little darkness in a nook and cranny, that sounds terrifying, especially at night. And again, that extra contrast, the extra depth will just help this piece stand out even more. That being said, it's just a practice piece. And the other thing you're going to want to do is record the colors that you choose to put together. At the bottom of a piece, I'll typically, that was really ugly, please don't look at that. But at the bottom of a piece, I'll typically write the colors that I use if they're on the marker. So like the color code right here. And then with a Sharpie, I would even write on here, I'd give it a color code, like blue 8, depending on how many blues are in the box. And then just down here in the corner, I like to write those color codes so that I can flip back through my book and find the colors that I used. Again, these ones I just know which one it is. It's especially with the Tombos that I do that. If I know that I'm going to want to use it again, color codes for sure. And even doing something like this so that you know what all of your colors look like can be really, really helpful when you go to pick which ones you're going to mix together. So don't feel like because they don't have color codes, you can't put your own on there to help you know exactly what colors will look nice together. This whole thing, just these letters need to get moved over a little bit. But that's okay, because just playing, and we're doing this one just because. However, next week I'm going to be taking this and putting it onto a final card. So I hope you will join me for that live, where we take the composition, we take the color, and we make, or we create, to stick with the k sound, we create a final piece. And we'll take it even a step further with really making this design pop off of the page.